Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorjan. I'm here with London Paul. And Paul, it's kind of interesting. We've talked on different aspects of the Ukraine-Russian conflict, but there's one probably underlying thing we have to look at, and that is why the West should never have gotten into this conflict in the first place. Take a look at where it started. 2013, 2014, outside of just right about the time of the Sochi Olympics. Putin then sent in and made it clear that he was going to protect the ethnic Russians in the Donbass and the Donetsk regions. There was a slight layoff. There was really nothing that happened over the Trump administration, but once a return to the Biden-Obama administration, all of a sudden, boom, a lot of things got forward, and they wanted to go ahead and try to expand this to go after Russia. But the consequences, as we are seeing, are going to be dire and detrimental. Anyway, Paul, I want to thank you as always for being a part of this great discussion. And what are your thoughts in regards to why the West should have never even stepped its toes into this battle?
Well, obviously, first off, Ken, thanks as well for joining me. It's always a pleasure when we can get together. Yeah, I thought this was an interesting discussion point. And really, it does go all the way back to 2014. For me, that really was the watershed moment when multipolarity finally got its teeth and really started to accelerate developments in the global south. And we know almost immediately the Chinese and the Russians signed the Power of Siberia 1 gas pipeline deal, all to be transacted in non-dollar terms. That was a deliberate statement of intent. And the Ukraine war was a catalyst and a realization amongst, particularly for the Chinese and the Russians, they are quite happy, the Americans, to go and overthrow a democratically elected leader in Europe, have a Maidan, and put in a puppet government in the process. And we're not going to get into discussion about the Maidan itself, and everyone knows that it's all, historical record now. But in essence, that was the catalyst for this. And you're absolutely right, Ken. The Russians were helping these so-called separatists in Donbass and Donetsk and Lugansk. There was a kind of civil war, for want of a better description, that was ongoing from around 2014 right through to when the Ukraine war started in February of 2022. There was obviously clear indications from the West at that point that they were considering sanctioning Russia heavily, including removing them from SWIFT. That was mentioned on more than one occasion by the Obama administration. So that set alarm bells ringing, where there was a clear indication, well, we could freeze our banks, we could cut us off from SWIFT, and we could have some serious problems. So then Russia started to make many internal changes, including import substitution and changing their internal economy. So in the event of that happening, they will be prepared in the future to deal with it. Okay, it was obviously a work in progress and ongoing, and it's really still ongoing now, although a lot of processes are in place for them to be self-sufficient. I'm not talking about the self-sufficiency from, where their energy's independent and food independent. A lot of it is related to their ability now to manufacture products themselves or have other markets where they're not dependent on the West. But in essence, the West telegraphed its intentions. Of course, then there was the whole failed Minsk agreements, which subsequently Merkel basically admitted it was a stalling tactic. So obviously Ukraine could mobilize its forces. Mobilize it for what is not in doubt now what they were mobilizing for. Okay, there's an argument, were they mobilizing it for in a defensive capacity or an offensive capacity to try and finally break the back of these separatists in Donbass, in Donbass. So that's an argument that I don't think anyone's really clear what their real intention was. But anyway, so by the time 2022 came around, and obviously Russia felt highly that they were provoked into this war. There was a lot of very sort of strange and puzzling comments coming out where Zelensky was talking about joining NATO, and there was mention of nuclear weapons in some capacity. And well, okay, Russia ended up invading, and then the rest history. We've had 2.5 years of a war, but Russia was already fairly well prepared to handle the fallout. So that was the first big mistake. They totally overlooked the fact that Russia had had 8 years to make quite significant preparations. Okay, there's an argument. They've obviously massively scaled up their war effort, but they're already starting to make those changes. They're already making preparations for, the potential fallout of being totally isolated, as the West decided, or the United States decided to do at the start of the Ukraine war. So that's the background that's extremely important. It didn't all start on day one of the Ukraine war itself. And then you come on to the principal reasons having the war starting, having the fact that Russia invaded and then making policy decisions that were completely idiotic. And the idiotic ones were to include the sanctioning the Russian central bank, freezing their assets. I mean, that was the biggest acceleration of the global south, de-dollarization, and it's been certainly the catalyst for multiple changes in Africa, in Southeast Asia, also in Russia itself and China itself, in terms of internationalizing the yuan and accelerating that process. And all these alliances realizing the need to get out of the dollar, because they could be the next nation who gets sanctioned. If they were sanctioned like the Russians were, many of them would collapse. They couldn't survive. Russia survived, not least, and this is another staggering oversight by the West, to not realize Russia has massive resources and could survive those kind of sanctions. And also the West completely miscalculated the fact that the Russians had this huge support from global South countries. They thought all these countries would panic and get into line and do as they were told. There's no doubt for me, the US hiking interest rates, which ties in with the start of the Ukraine war, that there's no coincidence there. That was to put enormous pressure on global South countries, cripple their currencies, and force them basically into submission, and that failed. And it failed, and it will remain a mystery to the US for the next 1,000 years, but it failed principally because these countries realized there was an alternative, and they realized as well that their currencies were under attack by the United States. And of course, it failed to materialize. Yeah, countries have had problems for sure, but predominantly they've managed to deal with that. So that was another hugely stupid policy decision that was going to backfire so badly on the United States. They couldn't see that was the case. And, from my perspective, to write on the day on Twitter, as it was then, that if you're going to implement the sanctions you suggest you're going to do, you're going to destroy the West in the process. And the West will end up collapsing. It was a statement from me of the obvious, because you knew where this was going. The United States never looked at this. Now, the US can sit there and go, well, it doesn't matter if we wreck Europe. Well, it does matter if you wreck Europe. There are consequences for wrecking Europe, and that reckoning is going to come to the United States in the fallout of when the war ends. Because you can't just sit there and think, well, it doesn't matter, if Europe gets wrecked and we survive. But the United States is having its own problems now, because precisely from decisions they made in terms of sanctioning Russia and all the policy decisions they made. This is a consequence of why the United States has massive budget deficits, why the dollar is struggling, why gold is now a reserve asset in the eyes of many in the global south as opposed to US Treasuries. There's a whole raft of reasons why this was a spectacularly bad decision in terms of the damage it would do to the United States and its allies in the process.
You know what's fascinating is earlier this week we did a podcast on the deep state and the establishment, and for all intents and purposes, this conflict in Ukraine directed at Russia is really something that was concocted. State Department, the intelligence agencies, maybe some in the military, definitely those in the military industrial complex, seeking ways to profit from arms. And so there was really, the bottom line is there was ideologies going back to the era of the Cold War. You even had think tanks. You know, Victoria Nuland, who is the architect of much of the Maidan coup, she was a pseudo member of the national security advisors, but she was also tied to some of the think tanks and those type of agencies. So there was really no true mission in this. It was simply create chaos and starve Russia and force Russia to kowtow to Western hegemonic, demands. And with that being said, Russia, as we know, had after things had toned down with the Minsk agreement. Yes, the West was behind the scenes preparing for part two of this, and to go, but Russia was spending a year detailing everything: what's going to happen economically, what's going to happen financially, what's going to happen to our exports, what's going to happen to A, B, C, D, whatever. They were fully prepared for virtually everything that the West could throw. And this is, to be honest, why it has been such a colossal success in regards to any type of conflict, when you're not just being faced with a foreign nation, but a foreign nation backed by an entire hemisphere of military advisors, intelligence, etc. It's really been, not really a conflict at all, but sort of a strategic move on the chessboard. But because of the fact that there are so many different entities within Europe, within the United States, not working together, but all doing their own thing for their own desires and own ideologies, it has created what we have today. You have to wonder who, and we're not going to speculate on names or whatever, but which entities took it upon themselves, because I don't think this was probably a President Biden thing, to blow up the Nord Stream pipeline or to try to take out the bridge in Crimea. These things are done by individuals within the bureaucracy, within the establishment, because they have the power and the authority. And what is the president going to do? Is the president going to come out and take, yes, I ordered this, which could be seen as a declaration for war? Or is he going to say, I have no idea what's happening, and prove themselves incompetent because they're no longer in control of the executive branch that they are supposed to be in control of? So you have all these entities in the West working, and the bottom line is they don't have the foresight to see what the consequences are. They were completely baffled by just how strong Russia is and how prepared Russia is and the responses that have happened. And they fully disregarded the creation and establishment of the multipolar world that was an instantaneous conduit that Russia could open up and move to outside of SWIFT, which makes the economic warfare sanctions and the holding the Damocles sword of SWIFT over Russia or any other country absolutely moot. And so everything that has gone forward after that has been just sort of like stabs in the dark. They don't know what to do. And they know that Russia, because they were so successful in what they did early on, what they were able to do, they know that those red lines that Russia talks about, they don't dare cross them. And that's why pretty much at a certain point, when they knew the jig was up, they're trying to save face, at least the leaders are, I think there are still those within the deep state establishment who still think that they can wreak havoc and win this thing, but they're just, ideological nutcases. And until we see the finality of it, you're going to get what happened with Zelensky, who now all of a sudden knows that he holds power by a tenuous thread. He's going to try to hold the West hostage by declaring, get me in NATO now, or we're going to get nukes and we're going to threaten everybody.
Yeah, but to be fair, 2 minutes later, he comes back, goes, no, I was misquoted, misunderstood. I didn't mean what I said about nuclear weapons. Really, it doesn't matter what Zelensky says anymore.
Yeah.
No one's listening, including particularly the West. And I think increasingly the hardliners on Ukraine policy have all been sidelined. You never hear from them anymore. They've gone quiet because now there's just a total broad acceptance. The war's over. But coming back to bad decisions and just a lack of thought with regards to prosecuting this war as a proxy nation or group of nations, the one thing that the United States, who's the driver, went into this with no idea there was no plan. There was no idea what they were going to do, what the consequences were of what they were going to do. It was just totally ideologically driven by certain individuals who have this absolute hatred of Russia for whatever reason, and it doesn't matter what the reasons are. The point is, and that was what was the driving force. And when you're driven by hatred, you make very, very spectacularly bad decisions because you're not acting rationally, you're acting completely irrationally. And the one thing with respect to the military and is United States, one of its principal sort of levers of power in an hegemonic sense has been this idea of its military supremacy. And the Ukraine war has demonstrated the United States has no military supremacy. All its game changers have proved to be useless. Its military technology has been proved to be useless. It doesn't matter whether it's aircraft, doesn't matter whether it's missiles, doesn't matter whether it's air defense systems. They've all been proved to be useless, as is, all these Leopard tanks that were supposed to be game changers. None of them have succeeded. So this has caused a massive backlash and huge damage to the military industrial complex, who previously could go all over the world selling arms. Well, those days are over. Who's going to buy them? Because they're going to look at it and go, well, those weapons didn't work in Ukraine. You told the world they were game changers, and none of them were game changers. So that is something they spectacularly failed to grasp, that much of the military hardware we produce in the West is expensive junk, and there's no other word for it. So that's one problem, that because they have this hubris, they have this idea that they're all in Top Gun. That's the American perception of our military. We're dominant, we're the major power. Well, as soon as you take on a real power who can bite back and fight back, the US is hopeless. And the other thing the war has highlighted is the United States cannot fight ground warfare now in the modern era. They are incapable of doing it. So that is another problem they didn't think of, but they should have learned from. The lessons in Vietnam was a classic example where the US failed there. But again, they just have this hubris and this idea that, we're the United States, we're the dominant power, instead of learning the lessons of history. And then militarily, the other part they completely failed to grasp is Russia's military superiority. Now, I've been talking about this, and we've talked about it, Ken, for years. It's self-explanatory that Russia had military superiority across the board. And Russia's had a history of being able to win wars of attrition. I mean, you look at what happened, all the battles during World War II as one example. They can just keep fighting. And I've always made this point, if it was down to the last two 90-year-old grandmothers waving pots and pans at the enemy, they would fight to the last two people. That's the Russian mentality, and the Americans and the West just never understand anything about Russia. So they completely miscalculated the mood of the Russian people as well, which they should have understood, because if we can understand it, what's their excuse? Well, there is no excuse. And then, of course, they completely misunderstood that the Russians never wanted to go into this war and take the whole country. Like, they just convinced themselves that Putin was after Soviet Union 2.0, which he never was and never will be. So when there was the opportunity, a matter of weeks, to end the war, and the Ukrainians had all but agreed to it, and then Johnson went over, and then the agreement was torn up, and that was the end of it. You know, that was an opportunity, but they saw the Russian tactics as weakness, that what Russia couldn't do, didn't have the military personnel to take the country. We can defeat them because they only put 30,000 troops on the outskirts of Kiev. Well, that's all they've got. And if they could take Kiev, they'd take it straight away. Well, they never wanted to take Kiev. And it's this constant lack of understanding of reality, and why, again, they should never have gone to war. They must have understood Russia had a far bigger military. But again, it's just this simple situation. They think Russia's still like it was in the 1980s, when its military was useless. Russia was basically a broken empire that was on the verge of collapse, and it collapsed a matter of years later. They don't understand that's not what Russia is. And that kind of arrogance and ignorance of reality was another reason why you should never, ever have considered going into a proxy war with Russia. And apart from anything else, there's one very simple issue here. Russia is the biggest nuclear power in the world. So if that is the case, which it is, what do they think the outcome of a war with Ukraine would be? If Russia's backs were against the wall and they were losing, and it was an existential threat to the Russian nation, they would have resorted to nuclear weapons. Absolutely. Irrefutably. And they admitted that, and have admitted it. So how did they ever think Ukraine could win a war against a major nuclear power? Because if the worst came to the worst, the Russians would have done that. And again, Russia's told them so many things and they've never listened. So the military angle to this is hugely important, because it's not just the fact we're sat here now with, I think there was some Western report that there might be in total as many as 2 million Ukrainian casualties. That includes killed in action, missing in action, and injured, beyond, so they're incapacitated, basically. I think probably 800, 900,000 are dead Ukrainians, and they're not sure what the other percentages are. They're kind of Western estimates that you won't see very often. So arguably it could be even greater than that. So they never thought either of sitting there and going, well, what happens if Russia wins this war? What does this mean for Ukraine? What does it mean for NATO? What does it mean when Europe collapses, if they'd worked out? Because if we can work it out, they should have worked it out. What does this mean for the United States' standing on the world stage? And if you accept the fact Russia's a nuclear power, and if the worst comes to the worst, it's going to resort to using those weapons, therefore you can't defeat them. What's the purpose of this war? But because they had no direction, no strategy, no actual idea, why are we doing this? What's our end goal? What do we think we're going to achieve by doing this? No, did anyone have any proper risk assessment of what they were getting into, and how is the world really going to react to this, the global south, and what could happen to our partners? What does that mean in the long term for their economies? What does that mean for us, because we're all interconnected financially and economically? What does it mean for NATO? No one sat there and did any risk assessment. They basically saw an opportunity and went, we can destroy Russia here. And just because they believed we can destroy Russia, they went in all guns blazing with not an ounce of thought given to any aspect of the conflict in any way, shape, or form, whether it's directly, indirectly, and what the fallout could be, might be. And that's why, if they'd actually sat there and worked all this out, anyone with an ounce of common sense would have gone, you should never, ever, ever go into Ukraine in this thing. If we've got a grievance and problems with what's going on in Donbass, well, why didn't we implement the Minsk agreements? Why didn't they use the opportunity where now Ukraine's going to lose a lot more territory? The fallout's going to be far worse than if they just accepted this agreement in April of 2022. But again, it's people driving policy with ideological hatred, and that is never, ever the answer to conducting any policy, whether it's domestic, foreign, whether it's in your own individual personal life. If you're driven by hatred to do something, you are destined to fail, and fail spectacularly badly.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great way to end this discussion. Paul, I want to thank you as always for being a part of this great debate that we are putting together.
And likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you for being a part as well. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share, comment. Let anybody know who you think this might be of importance to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.